The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. I know that since our last episode went live last week, we have had lots of new listeners and viewers, so whether you've been here with me for years or just a matter of days, I am thrilled that you're part of our crew. This is a podcast dedicated to strange but true stories of all kinds, whether that's bizarre true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, unexplained phenomena, or tales from the paranormal and supernatural realms. As long as you're into the strange and unusual, there's a little something here for everyone. And today's topic is no exception. When one of our fab listeners, Peter, got in touch with this subject suggestion, I did something I hardly ever do, and I put it right at the top of my episode ideas list. Because by making the pitch, Peter actually triggered a memory for me, and I realised that this topic used to fascinate me as a child. I just hadn't thought about it in years. Until now, of course. So today, we're going to be exploring the bewildering phenomenon known as sudden savant syndrome. And I think you'll see just why my younger self was so captivated by this rare yet utterly fascinating condition. Fingers crossed my voice holds out today, as I'm sure you can hear it's still a bit dodgy. My usual disclaimer that I am not a doctor or a psychologist, and none of this is medical advice. I'm simply a strange but true storyteller who has spent many an hour reading about this topic. I'm just presenting to you what I've learned, filtered through my own understanding. All of that said, let's begin. So, what on earth is sudden savant syndrome, also known as acquired savant syndrome? Well, it's an incredibly rare phenomenon whereby a person suddenly gains the ability to perform a particular skill to the highest level. And I don't just mean that they discover they have a general aptitude for something or do better than expected when trying out a new hobby. I'm talking about a person becoming an overnight genius, or a savant, if you will, hence the syndrome's name. And often the particular field in which the person develops these astonishing spontaneous talents is something they've never previously had anything much to do with. It could be that someone who spent their entire academic life getting average grades in their maths lessons is suddenly able to do unthinkably complex mental arithmetic, or that a person who had barely ever put pencil to paper before is one day able to draw perfectly accurate portraits entirely from memory. And when I say it's rare, I'm not exaggerating. According to a 2015 study, only 32 cases had ever been identified at that point. So if you were to take into account the generations that have passed since these records began, it can start to feel like a 1 in a billion kind of situation. Now, it's important that we make a distinction right here at the start of our discussion, because it's believed that there are actually two different types of this syndrome. One is sudden savant syndrome, which we're going to be focusing on today, and the other is simply called savant syndrome. This second area of the condition is largely associated with a small percentage of neurodivergent people, often people who have an autism diagnosis. In this instance, the person's exceptional abilities in a certain area exist concurrently with their neurological difference. Just how many neurodivergent people have this essentially inherent savant syndrome is constantly being debated by experts, with some maintaining that it's still quite rare and others arguing that as many as 1 in 10 autistic people are, to some degree, a savant in a certain area. This is certainly an interesting topic in itself and something that is continually being researched. But for our episode today, we're going to get back to discussing the sudden or acquired savant syndrome, which is quite different. Now, whilst I may have implied in the introduction that those who experience sudden savant syndrome gain their newfound genius level talents out of nowhere, that's not strictly true, because throughout most of the documented cases, there is one specific thing that each person appears to have in common, and that is that they had experienced some kind of accident or medical condition which caused damage to their brain. And often, very soon after this trauma, is when they present with their remarkable new ability, sometimes directly after leaving their hospital bed. Let me tell you about just a few of the astounding examples of this rare condition, because these people's stories are truly amazing. I'm going to begin with perhaps the most famous 21st century case of the syndrome, the tale of Jason Paget. Back in 2002, he enjoyed going out with his friends at the weekends, attending parties, and generally living that carefree lifestyle. At the time, he was living in Tacoma in the US state of Washington, and having dropped out of his local community college, he was working as a futon salesman, which was funding his weekend partying. At school, Jason had never had any interest whatsoever in maths, calling it stupid and failing to understand how it would ever serve him out there in the real world. However, on Friday the 13th of December of that year, his life was about to change in a way he could have never imagined. That night, whilst Jason was out on the town with friends, he was viciously attacked by two men outside a karaoke bar. In a BBC article, Jason described the incident by saying, quote, "I heard as much as felt this deep, low-pitched thud as the first guy ran up behind me and smashed me in the back of the head. And I saw this puff of white light, just like someone took a picture. The next thing I knew, I was on my knees and everything was spinning, and I didn't know where I was or how I got there." Jason explained that he then took himself to a nearby hospital where they treated him for concussion and an injury to his kidney from a punch he received, but ultimately sent him home. Fascinatingly, as he was recovering, Jason began to experience some drastically changed behaviours due to the head trauma he had suffered, which actually involved an onset of obsessive-compulsive disorder, something experts believe can also be triggered by a brain injury. But that wasn't all. On his walk home from the hospital on the night of his attack, Jason had begun to encounter something which he found both utterly confusing and completely beautiful. It was as though everything he could see, from the water flowing from a tap to the clouds in the sky, were overlaid with these choppy, pixelated edges, which became more like geometric grid lines in his mind as time went on. Desperate to understand what he was seeing, he did some online research and stumbled across the super complex mathematical concept of fractals. Fractals are often found in nature, and it's the idea that seemingly infinite repetitions of shapes and patterns make up what we see. For example, the way that snowflakes are comprised of the same repeated patterns over and over again are considered fractal-like. To try and express what he was experiencing, Jason felt compelled to create thousands of geometric drawings of what he could see, and it's a good job he did so. He ended up taking the drawings with him when he would go out and about, and one day whilst he was at a shopping centre, a man happened to pass by him and spotted one of his works. The man told Jason that he was a physicist and recognised that these drawings looked highly mathematical. He seemed amazed at the way Jason was able to visualise these fractals and encouraged him to take a maths class. This set Jason off on a path of discovery where he was able to learn the language he needed to properly explain what he was able to see. Jason has gone on to give TED Talks, national news interviews, and even wrote a book about his experiences, which at one point was tipped to be made into a film adaptation starring Channing Tatum, although it appears that the project didn't end up moving forward. I think his story is so captivating because of the stark contrast between the person he was prior to his injury versus afterwards. And this is something Jason has spoken about himself, saying, quote, "I do feel like two people, and I've had my mum and dad say that. It's like having two separate kids." Another case that has been well documented from over in the US is that of Derek Amato. When Derek was 39 years old, he admits that he still had what he describes as a devil-may-care attitude to life. I'm sure that we can all relate to that feeling that we're invincible and that nothing can go wrong. I know that I was definitely like that myself when I was a teenager. But poor Derek was about to discover that his luck on this front had run out. In October of 2006, Derek decided to dive headfirst into the shallow end of a swimming pool. A very, very bad idea, of course, and Derek soon realized this. The second his head hit the tiles, he knew he'd injured himself badly. This had all taken place during a pool party he was hosting at his mum's house, and when his friends realised something had gone very wrong and they pulled him out of the water, he couldn't stand up properly or hear anything they were saying to him. Derek was taken to hospital, where he was diagnosed with serious concussion and told that the hearing loss he'd experienced at around 35% would not only stay with him, but would likely worsen over time, along with his general memory function. I cannot imagine how difficult it would have been for Derek to hear this news, all because of one split-second bad decision. Despite how bruised and sore his entire body felt after recuperating at his mum's house for a while, he finally felt up to heading home and getting back to some kind of normality. But the evening before travelling home, Derek decided to call in and say goodbye to his friend Rick, and this turned out to be a very important decision indeed. In an article from The Guardian, Derek describes what happened next, saying, "Rick is a musician and lives in an apartment full of instruments. We were just sitting around talking when I felt an intense, utterly compelling need to touch his piano. I just moved over and started playing. There was no transition. It was all at once, like I'd been doing it all my life." Derek explained that whilst he'd played the guitar in a couple of small rock bands in his youth, that was about it. Yet he was now sat in the home of his musician friend, quote, "producing a fluid melody I'd never heard before." Rick stared, open-mouthed. "Derek," he said, "what's going on?" I had no answer. I just wanted to keep playing. When I first read this, it gave me goosebumps, and I feel the same now too. It's just incredible. And this gets even more amazing, because when Derek first had his accident, he described seeing blobs in his peripheral vision, all kind of moving around. But now he said these blobs had formed into a kind of wave pattern in his mind, and that when he was playing the piano, he just let his fingers follow the blobs and it would produce this beautiful, seemingly improvised music. Derek was formally diagnosed as having Acquired Savant Syndrome after being assessed by a neurologist, and we'll discuss more about what was said during that process when we get to our theory section. But for now, I wanted to let you know about one other notable case that relates back to the reason that I was so personally enthralled by this topic as a kid. I always had this secret hope that one day I would wake up and be able to speak every language in the world. It may not surprise you to learn that I've always been a certified chatterbox, and if I were able to communicate with literally anyone in the world in their native language, it would be a dream come true. And whilst this next case isn't quite as extreme as that, it's pretty remarkable. So, back in 2012, 18-year-old Ben McMahon was in a terrible car accident in his home city of Melbourne, Australia. A large truck had run through a red light and crashed into the side of his car, leaving him with fractured ribs, a fractured sternum, and a concussion so severe that he was placed into a coma for around a week. When he emerged from his coma, he remembers being in and out of consciousness for a couple more weeks, which must must have been so disorientating. But as strange as things were at this time for Ben, they were just as strange for his loved ones too. Because when he first regained consciousness, the first person he spoke to was a Chinese nurse who had been caring for him, and he spoke to her in Mandarin. Fluent Mandarin. Now, Ben had studied basic Mandarin in the past and knew some conversational phrases, but he was far from being fluent. Yet, after waking from his coma, he was not only speaking the language as though he'd been doing it forever, but he was even thinking in Mandarin. In an interview with Vice, Ben said, "After the accident, my internal monologue, the voice that kind of speaks to you in your head, that just switched. And so from that moment onwards, it just became so much more natural and so much more fluent. There was no first thinking in English, then translating to Chinese and speaking. It was just straight Chinese." How amazing is this? Ben was already very interested in Chinese culture, and with these incredible newfound language skills, he decided to make the most of it. He ended up moving to Shanghai to study, and even appeared on a hugely popular Chinese TV dating show. When you hear him talk in interviews, it's almost as though you can still detect a hint of bewilderment about this turn of events in his voice, even all of these years later. And whilst Ben hasn't been diagnosed with sudden savant syndrome as far as I know, it seems to me that there are a number of similarities between his case and many of the others I've read about, including what doctors have told him about why they think he may have gained these new skills after his head injury. And here is where we segue into the theory section of this episode. Now, as this is such a rare medical phenomenon that's not fully understood yet, there is no one single explanation as to why it happens. But there are two leading hypotheses, and I'll do my very best to explain them based on everything I've read. So, the first theory relates to the idea of synesthesia, which is when different senses that aren't usually linked have a kind of crossover within the brain. If you're an avid social media user, you might remember that back in around 2022, this term was being thrown about left, right, and centre on platforms like TikTok. It's thought that around 4% of people might have some form of synesthesia, and one of the most common types, and the one that a lot of people on TikTok were claiming to have, is called grapheme colour synesthesia. This is when words are associated with colours. So, for example, someone with this condition could see the name Stephanie as being emerald green, or Thursdays as being pale yellow. Anyway, what some experts believe is that this principle could be applied to some of those with sudden savant syndrome. There's a brilliant BBC article which outlined this idea, explaining that, quote, "When the brain is injured, dead and dying cells leak serotonin into the surrounding tissue. Physically, this seems to encourage new connections between brain regions," and goes on to quote neuroscientist Berit Brogard, who added, "We found permanent changes before. You can actually see connections in the brain that weren't there before." So in the first two cases I told you about today, those of Jason Padgett and Derek Amato, this concept is something they both seem to have embraced. In his piece for The Guardian, Derek Amato explained that he'd been told that the blobs he sees are a form of synesthesia, describing it as a union of the senses that allows me to literally see the music I'm composing. He expressed the belief that his head injury somehow unlocked something latent, or allowed him to make use of part of his brain that he had never accessed before. And I completely understand why he would feel this way. I know that if I discovered I could suddenly play a musical instrument to an incredibly high standard, I would wonder whether that talent had been within me all along, but was just missing some kind of link to another region of my brain. In Jason Padgett's case, Berit Brogard, the neuroscientist, spent several hours speaking with the mathematics savant and hypothesized that he was also experiencing synesthesia, saying that his brain injury had likely prompted the condition, meaning that certain things would trigger Jason into having these visions of geometric shapes. In order to try and prove this, Brogard actually flew Jason to a specialist research unit in Finland, where he was given a number of MRI brain scans. And whilst these scans were happening, the research team would flash up equations on a screen for Jason to see. Some of them were real and some were fake. And they monitored which parts of his brain lit up in response to the different images. When speaking about what the scientists discovered, Jason said, "They found that I had access to parts of the brain that we don't have conscious access to. And also the visual cortex was working in conjunction with the part of the brain that does mathematics, which obviously makes sense." And this actually led Jason to receiving formal diagnoses of both Acquired Savant Syndrome and synesthesia. Isn't that fascinating? It makes me wonder how many more uniquely intriguing cases throughout history could have also been identified if this kind of testing had been available. But we do have a second theory to discuss, and this one is more in line with what Ben McMahon was told after waking up from his coma fluent in Mandarin. When asked by Vice whether experts had ever presented him with any hypotheses about what had happened to him, he replied, quote, "One of the theories was that for English speakers, most of our language memory is on the left side of the brain, but for some reason, Chinese speakers use both hemispheres of the brain more than, say, your average English speaker, and I received most of the impact on the left side, so that side needed to rest and repair itself. Potentially what then happened is the brain went, okay, the left side needs to go into more rest. Let's shift the language activity over to the right side, and for that reason, maybe Chinese became more natural." And interestingly, this is something that's been backed up by multiple studies over the years. The evidence really does seem to show that when the analytical left brain, which can be more domineering, is damaged, the creative right brain is free to rule more of the roost. Even more interesting is how neuroscientists came to look into this theory in the first place. Now remember, at the very start, I mentioned that Acquired Savant Syndrome has been found both in people with accidental brain injuries and other medical conditions. Well, whilst there have been some documented cases in patients who discovered they had a new talent after experiencing a stroke, there are also believed to be some cases of the syndrome in those living with dementia. In 1998, a group of neurologists put together a case report after observing that 5 of their patients with a specific type of dementia, frontotemporal dementia, were all exhibiting these new artistic skills which they had never displayed before their dementia diagnosis. Because frontotemporal dementia only affects some areas of the front and sides of the brain, what the neurologist concluded was that whilst the parts of the patient's brains responsible for things like language and social skills were slowly being destroyed, other parts responsible for visual skills were untouched. The team described this as a possible facilitation of these artistic skills. Essentially, these undamaged areas of the brain were now able to flourish. Now, all of this brings me to a thought I've had throughout the entire process of researching this topic, and it's actually something that often comes up during interviews with those who've encountered sudden savant syndrome. At first glance, this entire subject has such a wow factor that it can be easy to have the same kind of attitude about it that I did as a kid, and focus on how amazing it must be to suddenly have this incredible gift dropped into your lap. But I think, throughout all of the stories I've shared, it's clear that this condition isn't something to be looked at as being all sunshine and rainbows. First of all, there's the fact that everyone with acquired savant syndrome has therefore been through some kind of awful trauma, from an attack or a car crash to a serious medical episode. The 1 in a billion chance that they would have become a savant as a result wouldn't have even been in their minds. I'm sure that all of those who experienced an accidental brain injury would have settled for simply making a decent recovery from the terrible event that happened to them. When Ben McMahon was asked whether he was, in some ways, happy his accident had happened, he replied by saying, "I don't think anyone is glad about, nearly dying and being in a coma for a week, but I'm very thankful and grateful that I woke up." And that kind of sums it up for me, because the chances of an outcome like sudden savant syndrome following a brain injury are so minuscule, and really more like a miracle than anything else. Given the chance, no one would actively choose the injury, which leads to my second point, that whilst these new talents are often viewed as gifts, not all gifts are fully wanted. Some with acquired savant syndrome have spoken of feeling as though it's not that they want to paint or play an instrument or do complex maths puzzles, it's that they feel compelled to. And as someone who has OCD myself, I know that when something becomes a compulsion, it can quickly become tiring, frustrating, and all-consuming. Plus, if you were to read up on this topic for yourself, before long, you'd be sure to stumble across internet forums and message boards discussing the legitimacy of individual savant claims about their skills. I'm sure that some of those who have gained these overnight talents have faced critics from time to time. I've personally seen forums dedicated to mathematics, for example, where certain savants have been accused of being frauds. To my mind, it would be pretty difficult to fake these astonishing skills, but of course there will always be skeptics no matter the topic, and it's always good to try and keep a fair and balanced outlook. On that note, it's important to say that just because someone gains these talents suddenly, it doesn't mean that they don't then practice and hone their skills. Many savants, like Jason Paget, knew that they needed to furnish themselves with more of a formal training to make the most of this hand they'd been dealt. Although this condition is so incredibly rare, I think it's going to be nothing short of gripping to see how medical advancements might help us to further understand the phenomenon in the future. And for the sake of my younger self and her utter fascination with this topic, I'm going to be trying to keep up with every new development. Wow, what a completely enthralling subject. I can't tell you how interesting it was to put this episode together. A massive thank you to Peter for suggesting that I look into sudden savant syndrome. It was just as captivating as I had imagined it would be to research. Had you heard of this phenomenon before? If so, had you realised how rare it was? And if this is something you're hearing about for the first time today, which phenomenon was it that you were completely and utterly intrigued by as a kid? I feel like we all had at least one, right? Reading your comments and messages is one of my absolute favourite parts of doing the podcast. So don't hesitate to get in touch and let me know your thoughts on today's episode. But we're not quite done yet, of course, because before I go and give my voice a rest, it's now time for the outro feature I know lots of you look forward to. Here is Weird Media. For Weird Media today, I'm very excited to be bringing you a book recommendation. And if you're a fan of all things spooky, I think this will be just your cup of tea. So back in December, I was lucky enough to receive this wonderful Christmas present from my friend Jenny. It's the book Real Ghost Stories by Jamie King. It was published in 2025 and there were so many things I enjoyed about it. First of all, it's full of all kinds of paranormal stories, and the way it's been divided up means it's so easy to pick and choose the ones you want to read. So the 4 key chapters are Vengeful Ghosts, benign ghosts, poltergeists, and paranormal activity. So if there was one area that particularly fascinates you, or maybe something you're less into, you know which stories are going to be most up your street. But secondly, I liked that all of the stories were kind of bite-sized. Some of them are 4 or 5 pages long, some are just a couple, so you feel like you're getting a brilliant overview of loads of different tales. And if you're like me and you feel like you only have time to grab 10 minutes here and there to read, the stories are the ideal length. Plus, I was absolutely buzzing to discover that a few of the tales are ones I've covered here on the podcast in the past. Weirdly enough, the first 2 chapters are about Zona Hester Shue, the Greenbrier ghost, who I told you about in episode 54, and also Teresita Bassa, whose story I covered in, I think, episode 42. How strange is that? I could not believe it when I first opened the book. So if you're planning on reading more in 2026 and you love your books to be on the spooky side, I think Real Ghost Stories is a brilliant pick, especially if you're short on time. I know that it's one of those books that I'll continue to pick off my bookshelf and flick through from time to time for years to come. Now, if you're a long-time listener, you'll know that at the ends of our episodes, I usually give you a rundown of all of the sources I used during my research for that particular installment of the podcast. I've decided to switch things up a bit this year, and what I'm going to be doing instead is actually listing my sources down in a written format, so you have them there to refer to whichever platform you're tuning in on. I actually think that providing links will serve as a better way of giving the sources the props they deserve. So that's what I'm going to be doing going forward. I also hope it will help the ends of the episodes to have a better flow to them. So that said, you'll find shout outs to all of the amazing sources I used in my research for today's episode in the show notes, or if you're joining me on YouTube, down in the description box. And on that note, I think it would also be helpful for me to properly link all of our social media pages and note down our email address in text form too, rather than always shouting them out verbally. I absolutely love to hear from you all, so if you'd like to get in touch and share your thoughts on Instagram, Threads, Facebook or TikTok, all of our pages will be linked for you, along with our email address. If you're watching on YouTube, please do feel free to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, and if you're joining on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, a quick rating or review for the show is always hugely appreciated and is an amazing free way to support the podcast. A massive thank you for joining me today. It's a really exciting time for the podcast, and I'm so happy to have you along for the ride. I can't wait to be back very soon with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.